Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and today I have with me Jonathan Marks. Jonathan's a partner at Baker Tilly, a longtime professional in internal audit and a wide variety of other functions, including the compliance space. I've known Jonathan. He was one of the first people I met on social media, and we've continued our friendship and collaboration since then. So, Jonathan, first of all, with an incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
So, Jonathan, as you know, I've got a second edition of my compliance handbook coming out, and one of the areas that I hit very hard in the first edition was investigations. And what I realized in writing the second edition is really that term investigation, I think, is no longer sufficient to describe not only the type of work you do, but what a compliance professional needs from the discipline in your end. So I was wondering if you might be able to start with the evolution you've seen in your own profession, literally since Sarbanes-Oxley, but maybe even from before that time.
Yeah, I think there really has been an evolution, and what I've seen from what we're doing today as compared to what we were doing, let's say 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, if you go back 30 years ago and you start with internal audit and what they were doing, they were a necessary evil. And they really weren't part of the overall, let's just say, risk management of the organization. And their role has really taken an expansive step upwards. And now today, with regards to what skills are needed and the types of people and the types of things that they're involved with and their importance within the ecosystem of the organization, and actually looking and helping with the risk landscape, it's remarkable, where everybody started from and where they are. So, for example, skill sets. Today you really have to be, I call it digitally athletic, meaning that you have to understand data analytics, you have to understand the sources of data, you have to understand, how to mine that data, how it's useful, the sources of truth, what type of feedback does that data tell us? Is that data being pushed back into the company in order to make more informed decisions? Can we use it for continuous monitoring of the business? So it's really changed there from a total skill set perspective. But when I look at people today, and I look at and I'm thinking about a while back, I could think of, if technology really didn't come into play all that much. I had my compact luggable. Communication, you really didn't communicate to many people. And when it came to critical thinking, there really wasn't too much critical thinking. But I think those are the three skills that have really come into play today, when it comes to sort of this transformation from, where we came, since Sarbanes-Oxley and where we are now.
Jonathan, one of the most interesting observations I've heard you make, second only to your definition of an internal control, is that you see the internal control provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley coming out of the FCPA internal control requirements under the books and records. I was wondering if you could kind of explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so let's a little bit. So the FCPA by itself places, responsibility for controls on the corporation in general, right? And then Sarbanes-Oxley specifically charges executive officers with internal control duties. Okay. I think, more specifically, the FCPA required public companies to institute effective internal controls to stop bribes. And actually, one of the things that I keep talking about is accountability, making those executives accountable under the FCPA. But 404 goes a little bit further than that and has somewhat similar goals. But the FCPA language around internal controls is somewhat interesting if you've ever read it, and I know you have. But devising and maintaining a system of internal control sufficient to provide certain assurances. Again, it's all the concept of reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. But it talks about transactions recorded in the books and records. It talks about a bunch of different things, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think those were foundationally the substance of what Sarbanes-Oxley was all about. Before before all of this, and before, actually even before, Sarbanes-Oxley, there was Fiducia 112 for financial institutions, which again, some say was the forerunner, to Sarbanes-Oxley. So if you take the FCPA and what the regulators have been doing all along, and the reason I always go back to financial services, because they seem to be the industry, because they're so transactionally based, and the risk is all on the transactions, where we look towards the regulators and the things that they're doing in order to see directionally where they're headed and what they're doing. But so if I had to look at this, you had the FCPA in '77, you had Fiducia 112 that came out years later, and then in 2002 you had the enactment of Sarbanes-Oxley. So that's why I think, and honestly, you and I have talked about this a lot. I remember specific conversations where we talked about the Smith and Wesson case, and the enforcement action. I think that was what, in 2014, 15, where the Security Exchange and the SEC since that has more aggressively pursued companies for violations of internal controls, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, again, I think there's an expectation here. It was sort of this shot across the bow where they said, hey, look, your books and records need to be neat and tidy, but you need to pay close attention to internal controls. And since the Smith and Wesson case, I know that we could sit here and talk ad nauseum about other cases where companies have been dinged for their for internal controls, or the failure to adequately maintain internal controls under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Jonathan, hopefully I wrote this down right, but you, I think, listed three key items of evolution in the internal audit profession as digitally athletic, communications, and critical thinking. If I got that right, is that what you see in the arc of evolution in the compliance profession? And is it still an evolving profession from your perspective?
I think it's evolving. I think some of those same attributes obviously, fall into the compliance profession. Um, again, if you look at where the regulators are headed with all of this, and I'm sure we'll get there in our discussion today, it just feels like it's headed in that direction. But if you talk about the enterprise risk resilient ecosystem, or you talk about business intelligence or things of that nature, you really have to have people that are not only digitally athletic, digitally athletic and understand technology, but you really need folks that are great communicators that can reach out and across and through silos and get that information or communicate that information. I think that's really, really important. I remember one of the things when I first started in auditing way back when in the late 80s. They said technically, you have to be obviously sound, but they said the most successful auditors are the ones that can communicate and build trust and relationships with people, because they tend to pull more information out of them. And obviously that goes into interviewing and all kinds of other skills and things like that. But I honestly go back to that every single time, is that the human in the loop, or the human factor is just so critical today, and probably even more so. And so when we start talking about sort of the evolution or the arc of compliance and of those same types of skills and capabilities, things that we're looking for, in the compliance profession, I think absolutely. I think no longer can you have that legal mindset, which you need, right? If you look at a lot of the chief compliance officers, they have a legal background. But I also think you need to understand, not only the technology and the communication piece, but if you're looking to build your best compliance robot, kind of what would that look like? You'd understand the law, you'd understand technology and data analytics, you'd probably understand a little bit of psychology, you probably understand auditing, you probably have to understand internal controls, and I could probably think of some other things too, if we were building the sort of the best compliance or the best chief compliance officer robot. But yeah, it's really, really upped people's games. And I think, there's a lot of other things that I think are going to change in the next couple of years, which are going to accentuate those skills. I mean, we're moving very, very quickly now. And if you can't keep up, it's like quicksand. It's going to swallow you in, and then it's going to be a problem. And so, I think that's a great question, and I think that I think compliance is still evolving, but I think those fundamental skill sets are here to stay.
One of the things, let me just pick up on that answer because I was going to ask you about the COSO 2013 internal controls framework and then an overall integrated structure of enterprise risk management as separate sort of developments. But it seems to me that if we are going to, and not if, but as we move almost exponentially in speed now, it's because is it because we had those developments? So we had a framework in place for nearly 8 years now in terms of the COSO framework, then
Mhm.
enterprise risk management integrated other risk management functions. Would that be a fair assessment, or do you see those as really independent of the speed of evolution of compliance today?
That's a great question. I think it pressed on it certainly pressed some buttons with regards to compliance. And as you well know, if you read through COSO, there's some interesting things there. So the framework, the 2013 framework, um, you know, if you go back to the 2013 framework, let me think for a second. That was really it was an enhancement, and it was designed, and it was to help organizations implement internal control, um, you know, in light of the many, the changing business and operating environments. I think there you might be onto something here, because, again, we talk about change and the pace of change. Since the issuance of that original framework, which was years before that. So, in the illustrative guide, as I think you wrote about this, COSO laid out its views on how to assess the effectiveness of internal controls, but it went on to say, an effective system of internal control, again, provides that reasonable assurance, but it talks about the entity's objectives relating to its operations, reporting, and compliance. And I think that word compliance, kind of stuck out to me. So, there are a couple of different things here, from an integrated approach perspective. So I think the framework kind of, again, sort of pushed on compliance, but again, I I think it did have something to do with this, but I also think it has something to do with the fact that if you look at the structure of businesses today and change, you had businesses that had expanded their supply chains. We've become more of a global type of an environment, and those risks obviously changed. So when you move to digital and you have everything digital and you're moving globally, compliance really does become more important. And having that overall integrated structure that COSO does generally provide, I think, is certainly a help. And I do think the 2013 guidance was, again, sort of an inkling of what was to be, and that was ERM, enterprise risk management. Because if we talk about enterprise risk management, we're talking about generally proactively identifying and assessing and monitoring and responding to risks and opportunities. Well, isn't that what we really want today from a compliance organization or a compliance function? We want to proactively identify these things. This is all about, if you look at the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and it talks about feedback, right? Perfect segue into the ECCP. They talk about feedback, and they talk about lessons learned and things of that nature. And the risk landscape. So I think COSO is great, and what they say, but integrating ERM into an organization's daily culture, I think, provides a bunch of different advantages. And it really, at the end of the day, it's informed decision making, and coordination of risk-related activities. And it does link, as I always say, I always look at the strategy, and the plans, and we always look at the barriers, obstacles, and hurdles in order to get there, and those enterprise risks, and I think the ERM framework that COSO also put out is really where we all should be. But it's it's really tough, I think, for an organization. I think a lot of folks think, that installing some of these things are rate limiting steps within their company and just, not necessary. But I think they'll all come to find out pretty shortly that the regulators are taking a pretty serious stance when it comes to compliance, and they're taking a pretty serious stance when it comes to fraudulent activity. And so, I think anyone that's not doing this today should really take another look and, again, crawl, walk, and run, but, try to do something from an ERM perspective.
Jonathan, in 2019, we had the original formulation of the evaluation of corporate compliance programs that was updated in June of 2020. And you also, in the context of that, the release of that document had one of the most prescient statements, which was you said that the 2020 update brought business intelligence to compliance. I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate that on that a little bit.
Yeah. Having a compliance program, and again, Tom, you and I have talked about this a lot, it's just not enough today. When we talk about business, so actually backing up a little bit here, just thinking about this question, if you look at the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, they really did emphasize, the risk assessment, right? The effectiveness and alignment of the risk assessment. They really did emphasize data access, relevant data and sources of truth. And they really did emphasize using lessons learned. As a matter of fact, I think they stated that probably 8 or more times, in order to review your program and adapt the program to the current risk landscape. So when we talk about using business intelligence, we're talking about continuously evaluating, and I think it's a step towards, enterprise resiliency. Like I said before, we talk about making it more, better and, more informed decisions. I think this is what it comes down to. But organizations today have to be flexible and nimble and adapt to changes of new risks, not only to survive, but also to evolve. So compliance really needs to be proactive. Specifically, it needs to be dynamic and a continually adapting process. So, but the one caution I would throw here is that business intelligence is way more than data analytics. It's a formal process that helps, the senior leadership team make, again, more informed business decisions, including enhancing their compliance program. It also accentuates, I believe, the need for compliance and internal audit to collaborate, which we haven't talked about yet. We mentioned it a little bit, but, I talked about reaching across the lines and, the silo thing, but, it's been my experience and understanding that internal audit, can improve the depth and breadth and coverage of the work, by using, some of these data techniques effectively, and working in collaboration with compliance. And I think the more risk resilient companies or enterprises today are the ones where you look at that, what I call the Bermuda Triangle, where you have internal audit, compliance, and legal, and they're all working harmoniously together, not only to identify risks, but they're also working, they're also sharing feedback, and they're also continuously evaluating, their risk assessments and how that translates and how it's operationalized within the business. So, it's really interesting. I am more excited today about, where we're headed, because I think it's, I think it uses a lot of, you have to be a dynamic, like I said, I talked about being digitally athletic. You really have to be an athletic professional today. You can't just be a one-trick pony. And if the only thing you know is the law, or the only thing you know is accounting and internal controls, I think you're going to suffer. So, especially in an organization that is going to be thirsty for business intelligence.
Jonathan, you were one of the first people I came across who not only talked about the need for a root cause analysis, talked about the rigor around it, but actually taught and lectured on the process of a root cause analysis. In the first evaluation of corporate compliance programs, largely authored by Wei Chen, which came out in 2017, they emphasized the root cause analysis. Why have you advocated for so long that a root cause analysis is absolutely essential, but more importantly, it's the rigor around your process, 5 whys or whatever you might call it, and then how you use that information?
Yeah, so, again, let's go back and unpack this a little bit. There's a difference between doing an investigation and understanding what root cause is. And so, um, or doing a risk assessment and understanding what root cause is. So when I look at root cause, it's really finding that one domino that fell that tipped off everything else. And I think the reason that we need to do that is because more often than not, a lot of times are people, a lot of times there are recommendations that are made, specifically related to internal controls, that are treating the symptoms and not the underlying issues. And then we have this funky word that I learned how to spell called recidivism. And so that same problem keeps happening or coming back. And I think organizations, now in today's regulatory environment, whether when you're in the public vein, fines and penalties and things, they're pretty significant these days. And so, but more importantly, from a root cause perspective, if you're doing, the 5 whys, or or any of the techniques that you can use in order to do root cause, I think it helps enhance the overall control environment by making more, laser focused recommendations, and again, treating those underlying issues, when it comes to designing internal controls. Because, again, it's not only the definition of internal control, Tom, that we've talked about ad nauseum. It's also, how do people design internal controls? So, you've heard me say, what's the definition of internal control to hundreds of people, and hundreds of people sit there, I sit there in silence because nobody can give me a definition of an internal control. When we talk about internal controls and we talk about root cause, I get sort of same and similar. And so, you know, um, it's no longer can you do an investigation. It's like I remember somebody saying to me one time, I think it was an audit committee chair, get in, get on, and get out, when it comes to an investigation. Okay, that's great. But what about all the recommendations? What about root cause? Even from an internal audit perspective, not even from an investigative perspective, are we really truly adding value to the organization by just giving sort of haphazard, recommendations or enhancements to controls? The answer to that is no. And so, understanding root cause, using Socratic questioning, using some of the techniques, such as the 5 why technique, understanding corporate governance, understanding culture, understanding the mechanisms on how it all comes together, understanding risk, which I think, a lot of people just don't understand. You say the word risk sometimes, and it's amazing that, it's amazing what you start to hear that come out of people's mouths. So like I give you a great example. When we're doing root cause, when we talk about risk, we talk about external or internal risk. So, and then you go down the path of an external and internal risk. Internal risks, we'll take that path just for an example for today's program. But you look at business relationships, or you look at the business environment, you look at your customers, you look at your third parties, you look at external things, you look at your geography, you look at your market and your industry, and then you keep peeling that and pushing that away, and getting deeper and deeper. And so, for example, you look at your customers, customer profiles, customer interactions, customers' use of your product or your service. When you look at third parties, your third party profile, the strength of your third party risk management program, geography, local culture. I mean, everyone out there, hopefully you understand that in different cultures, when you travel across the globe, people do things differently. And that local culture part is such a key in really understanding risk and how people react. That's that human element that I talked about before. You have to take that into consideration. And then, sometimes, and it could be, sometimes that could be, one of the root causes, if not a root cause, is that local culture. Maybe they didn't understand, maybe they weren't trained properly, maybe things got lost in translation. But, understanding root cause, understanding, how this plays, and understanding the value that it can bring, when you're doing an investigation, when you're doing a risk assessment, when you're designing an internal control, I think is just, it's almost necessary today. And, if you're in the compliance function, one of the things that I keep saying, when you're thinking about where you need to go and what you need to be, going forward, having a root cause program, within your own house is really necessary.
So, Jonathan, I was going to ask you, where did you see the compliance function in 2025 or beyond? But you've really given us several answers throughout this podcast. And it seems to be, if I can even go back and start with a digitally athletic, the communication and the critical thinking, but then you've overlaid some additional factors. Maybe I could ask, is it fair to ask one CCO to have all these skills, or would a different, if not better approach to be to have those skills available, whether they be internally in your corporate internal audit or have external subject matter experts that you can call upon when needed?
Yeah, I mean, if you're blessed with all that talent, you're lucky. I'm not that smart, so I think having those resources available is really critical and key. Like you said, Tom, they may not reside in house, but they do. I would make sure that you have somebody or a few folks or a go-to for some of these things. Like you mentioned, I did mention some themes where I think this whole thing is going, but people, process, and technology is something that we keep pounding on. From where compliance is headed. Obviously, from an enterprise risk resilient perspective, and partnering with the internal audit and legal is certainly something as well. So, when I keep thinking about what compliance will look like in the future, and what we're going to need, um, and those skill sets, I think it's still evolving, like I mentioned. But you know um, having resources, like they say in some of the regulatory guidance, to me is not only money, the budget available, but having those partnerships or relationships with the people that you can go to deal with some of these issues, in order to tackle them effectively.
So, Jonathan, we unfortunately are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any additional information on yourself or Baker Tilly, perhaps, or any of the topics you've talked about in this podcast. Where could they go?
Well, the first place I would go is bakertilly.com. I'm listed in there. You could certainly search for me, and that has many of my writings and some of the things that we're doing and some of the other resources that the firm provides. Or you can go to boardandfraud.com, which is a blog that I maintain, and look for some information there. A lot of this, I believe, I hope, some of the things that we talked about today are buried within a lot of my writings over the last couple of years. But if it's something that's not there, please feel to link up with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to help you any way I can.
Your mention of board and fraud actually makes me want to ask a special bonus question. We haven't really touched upon the board of directors in this podcast, but where do you see the board needing to be in 2025 and beyond for really any of these topics?
Yeah, we talk about board and we talk about risk and oversight, and I think the Bluebell ice cream case was a real wake up from a compliance perspective, that you just can't rely on certain information. You have to actually understand and almost touch to see, and to almost touch to know that it exists and it's functioning appropriately, and you need to get that information. So I think from a board member perspective, going into the future, I think you're going to have to start to ask some pretty tough questions. And I think those tough questions are surrounding, our audit process. What kind of audit process do we have? I think it starts like with internal audit, creating an internal audit plan. That's wonderful. But, if you're an organization and you stick to those 10 audits that you do every single year, and you don't move off of that based on the cadence of the company, the market, or the risks that come up, I think you're left way behind. There's a concept that gets thrown out there, which I'm not even going to mention the word, but I think you have to have an adaptable audit program, and that adapts to the risks and the things that are moving forward. I think the board needs to understand that, and they need to be flexible and understand that the risk landscape does change. It does change quickly, and asking senior leadership, and understanding whether senior leadership has that adaptability is going to be critical for a board. And I think you're going to have to ask and see and understand what the organization is doing in order to monitor. We didn't even talk about monitoring. what to monitor, how the organization is monitoring these things on an ongoing basis. Are we using as a tool continuous auditing or continuous monitoring, and their appropriate, the appropriate setup? What type of feedback are we getting? Is the information that the board is getting appropriate? I mean, you have to look at, your board package. What's included in your board package? Do you have all the information you need, again, in order to assess risk for the organization? So I think I think it has changed. I think it's gonna continue to change. But I think overall, if I had to give a board member one bit of advice, don't think you could just show up and phone it in. You really have to study what's going on, and you really have to stay ahead of the risk landscape and ask those types of questions. And you really have to be a student of the industry and that you're in, and what's going on there. And you also have to monitor what's going on from a regulatory perspective, because I think there's a lot of great lessons learned by other people's failures, and using those in order to enhance what you're doing is not a bad thing. So again, from an overall board perspective, that's where I would be going.
Well, Jonathan, we are now at the end of our time, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I greatly
Sure.
look forward to continuing the conversation.
No problem. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I value the friendship, and we've been friends for a long time, and you're doing a great thing here, Tom. So thanks so much for having me.